welcome to this event organized by the European Liberal Forum on the future of debt, money and banking.
The project that we will be discussing today was initiated in 2021.
The future of debt, money and banking is a project that we started a couple of years ago at the European Liberal Forum during the pandemic, when we started realizing changing perceptions of Europeans towards economic concepts like inflation, for example. And back then we noticed that apart from COVID deniers, we also had inflation deniers trying to convince us that inflation was not a risk, higher inflation was not a risk, or that we could control inflation, or when it started rising, that it would be just transitory. I would like to add also, as a way of setting the scene or setting the context for the discussions that will follow. They tell us that we cannot do anything about that because of the war, because of the energy crisis, because of all the systemic external shocks that we are facing. Well, that's not entirely true. We can do a lot on energy policy, we can do a lot on food policy in Europe, and that's exactly why we gathered here in Vienna to discuss with distinguished speakers and guests.
Elevated price levels are often down to tax and regulatory barriers imposed by governments across Europe. So just to give you an example, we are talking a lot about the energy crisis today, for good reason, but we're talking less about how the crisis could have been resolved 10 years ago and the inflation rate. But actually, I think the discussions about the monetary policy are super important. A lot of European countries have banned fracking or in the process of banning nuclear. So it's really government-imposed decisions that are leading to elevated price levels when it comes to energy. And that applies across the board. If you look at trade policy, we're being protectionistic against agricultural producers in Africa. If you look at some of the sin taxes that are imposed by governments on sugary food or unhealthy drinks, these are all raising the price levels for average European citizens across the continent.
They would cut inflation. I'm not as defeatist, to be fair. I think they're politically totally unreasonable. So one would be around trade policy.
So the solution is partially monetary, but governments themselves can do a lot in order to help with the cost of living crisis and implement tax and regulatory reforms that would lead to lower prices across the board.
In my opinion, Europe will be facing inflation in the longer run, which has less to do with the current supply problems, more with the structural issues which will be haunting the European economy. I'm talking about demographic changes, such as the fact that we are getting older, the fact that we need to decarbonize the economy, which is a necessity, but on the other hand, it builds up costs for production factors. And then we have an issue of deglobalization. There is an obvious political trend to shorten the supply chains, which will also additionally increase production costs. And then fourth, since countries in Europe are much in debt, there will be a lot of pressure not to be raising interest rates as much as was the case maybe in the last decades.
I kind of agree with this ballpark. So I don't think we will be going down before 2024.
All this will lead to the necessity of structural policies and supply side policies to be able to fight off a long-term inflation in Europe.
Europe has one big problem, and it's very high public debt. And we have shown 5 different ways to reduce the mountain of debt. Real GDP growth, inflation, nominal growth, financial repression, default or restructuring, and austerity. To reduce debt, if everybody's doing it at the same time, you might. What we find is that there are 2 ways to reduce the mountain of debt that we as liberals should really promote, and it is on the one hand to make growth-friendly reform possible, increase real GDP, and on the other hand to make smart austerity measures, to reduce government spending where it is necessary and make it more efficient in other areas. There is a very important share that is just going into teachers' pensions for the last couple of decades. This is actually the liberal way to reduce the mountain of debt, very necessary for the years to come.